values for inverse sine. And remember, it could have been written as arc sine of x. Also, those mean the same thing, are restricted to quadrants 1 and 4. Values for cosine are restricted to quadrants 1 and 2. And values for tangent are restricted to quadrants 1 and 4. Once again. Which, even though this isn't on your paper, then these circles should look familiar to you. Because over here, this is for the inverse sine. That circle's for the inverse sine and the inverse tangent. And just a reminder that the only answers that you are going to get when you do sine or you do tangent are going to be 0, pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, pi over 2, and their opposites. Negative pi over 6, negative pi over 4, negative pi over 3, negative pi over 2. Along the same lines here, use this when we see the inverse cosine function. And the only answers that we are going to get when we're dealing with inverse cosine are going to be 0, pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, pi over 2, 2 pi over 3, 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 6, and pi. So once we have those in our head again, remember only one answer, by the way. Once we have those in our head, then we can answer these questions. Well, the arc cosine of negative the square root of 2 over 2 is going to be 3 pi over 4. Let me write that again. The arctangent of square root of 3 is going to be pi over 3. The inverse sine of negative 1 is going to be negative pi over 2. Inverse sine of negative 1/2. Where does sine equal negative 1/2? And because we're restricted only to the first and the fourth quadrants, where does sine equal negative 1/2 in the fourth quadrant? It's going to be negative pi over 6. Where does tangent, on letter E, where does tangent equal negative 1? Well, where tangent equals negative 1, it's going to be in the fourth quadrant, negative pi over 4. And there again, there we see the arc cosine notation, but the option is still the same here. Where does cosine equal 1/2, which is pi over 3. And as we finish this section, here are some composition. Remember that when we do these problems, we're going to start here. And we need to figure out, well, what's the inverse tangent of negative radical 3 over 3? Well, the inverse tangent of negative radical 3 over 3 is going to be negative pi over 6. And now that we've figured out that value, then we're going to apply it to our sine function. So then the question is, well, what does the sine of negative pi over 6 equal? It's not inverse sine. It's what does the sine of negative pi over 6 equal? And that equals negative 1/2. Same idea over here on letter H. We have to figure out, well, what is the inverse cosine of negative radical 3 over 2? And we're going to be in the second quadrant because it's negative. And the inverse cosine of negative square root of 3 over 2 is going to be pi over 6, and that's not right, but I can fix it. How about 5 pi over 6, because it was negative. And then what we want to look at is, well, what is the cosecant of that? Well, remember that sine is the reciprocal of cosecant. So if we switch that up a little bit more, well then what is the sine of 5 pi over 6? And the sine of 5 pi over 6 is 1/2. So when we're looking at the cosecant here to finish this problem, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to take the reciprocal of 1/2, and we get 2. And this is our answer.